Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Vorhies, your host. I'm the Editorial Director with Data Science Central and also Chief Data Scientist for Data Magnum. I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Pivotal, Microsoft, Hortonworks, Oracle, IBM, and Teradata, to name just a few. Now, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com. If you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I'd encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Today's webinar is entitled, Applying Graphic Design Principles to Create Killer Dashboards. So before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format for today's webinar. Today's event will be an hour long. We have one panelist that I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation. And this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com in the next few days following today's live event. I'd also like to encourage all of our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. So I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dave Powell of Tableau. Dave is a solution architect at Tableau and has experience in data warehousing, analytics, 3 years of team lead project management experience, over 11 years of experience in higher education technology with a concentration in analysis and implementation of enterprise systems, and 15 plus years of marketing, design, and web development experience. He specializes in bridging the gap between functional, technical, and creative staff, and working with diverse client and user populations. Thanks for being with us today, Dave. We're looking forward to your presentation. So web and graphic design principles are tremendously useful for creating beautiful, effective dashboards. In this latest Data Science Central webinar event, we'll consider how common design mistakes can diminish visual effectiveness. In today's presentation, you'll learn how placement, weight, font choice, and practical graphic design issues can maximize the impact of your visualizations. So Dave, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me, Data Science Central. So without further ado, since we only have a short period of time, I'll jump right into my presentation. Just to give a little background, have been doing many things over the years, as you gathered from the brief bio that Bill gave you of me. I most recently, as he mentioned, am a solution architect at Tableau Software. As such, I serve in a consulting capacity, and I work with a number of clients, both enterprise and commercial, and help them gain insight into their data and structure not only their systems, but their processes surrounding how to use Tableau software and how to find data insights and make that most effective for their audience. So a few things we'll cover today. We'll be focusing on steps for interacting with users. We'll be talking about some basic tenets of graphic design, including visual hierarchy, color choice, font choice, or typeface choice, if you prefer. And we'll talk a little bit about prototyping, although that won't be a major emphasis of today's talk. We'll also talk about a little bit about establishing a brand, and then we'll take a look at how some of these common wisdoms of graphic design have been applied in visual analysis. But first, speaking of my past, I have a bit of a confession to make. I was once a graphic designer for a pantyhose company. I actually started off after my my undergraduate degree with a company called Americal Hosiery. I did also do socks, but that's not quite as glamorous as pantyhose. A lot of people may think that this was a great opportunity, and it was, because I got to work with the design and manufacturing groups of a number of very large brands in the U.S., including Target and Walmart and JCPenney, Banana Republic, Gap. I worked with many, many clients. We did lots of third-party products, and I got to do lots and lots of graphic design, primarily for print. And many of you may think that that is glamorous, and when you spend all of your time looking at probably legs all day, but in actuality, that job is a bit more like this. Spending most of my time staring at Photoshop, dodging and burning, and adjusting things at the pixel level. So, in addition to that experience in graphic design, as Bill also mentioned, I spent a great deal of time working on enterprise systems. I got into web development, which is how I came into this talk. And after a number of years working in enterprise systems, primarily in higher education, I made my way to consulting and then to Tableau, which I love, by the way. But this is not a presentation primarily about Tableau per se, although we'll look at some examples at the end of the presentation that will be in Tableau format. So, why do you need to know design? Well, this seems to be a bit of a touchy subject, depending on the audience I may be presenting to. As data scientists, you may or may not see much of a place for graphic design or simple graphic design principles in your visualizations. And many times, when we're focused solely on the data, we are thinking primarily of the presentation of that data and the story that it may tell, but there are many things about that story that can be influenced by our knowledge of design, and that's the purpose of this quick talk. So if you've ever worked with dashboards, if you've ever assembled your visualizations into something that tells a story, then you will find benefit from learning some of these design principles. So first, I'd like to ask a few rhetorical questions. First of all, when is our data at its best? Simply put, it's at its best when it's well understood, when it's interactive, when it changes how we make decisions, but more importantly, when it persuades others to make change. And this is one of the things that I spend much of my time on when I am working with Tableau clients, is finding that balance between exploration of data and consumption of data. And believe it or not, graphic design gives us the tools that we need to make that persuasive argument. So, what is practical design? I will, throughout the presentation today, refer to what I call practical design, and it's pretty much exactly what I say it is. It's practical design. It's the application of practical, common sense methods to design methodologies to your data visualizations. Primarily, I'm thinking of the consumption of these visualizations. Usually that's in a dashboard, but perhaps not. Perhaps it's the standalone visualization by itself. The idea is that it's not just these simple principles that we'll outline today. It's part of a greater process. That greater process is something that's been in use by graphic designers for many years. And basically, I'm just extrapolating some of these things because they're, in general, quite easy to understand. It's a simple way to get feedback, to speed up development time, and make your visualizations more practical. So, kind of following on that theme, I really like this quote. And I just wanted to toss that out to you guys for something to think of. Design and the presentation of our data is not just a simple application of skills. It's a way of thinking. It's a process. It's something that we can repeat day in and day out with our clients, be they internal or external. So one of the first things when we're working with our data is that we need to establish is our visual hierarchy. Well, as you might imagine, a visual hierarchy in a dashboard has a direct correlation to our data and the questions that we want to answer in our dashboards. So in order to pose those questions, in order to answer those questions, we have to know a few things. Who is our audience? Who will be consuming our data? What's the business question that our dashboard answers? This could also be a scientific question, if you are so inclined. But our visualizations have a purpose. That message that we convey is best presented to certain audiences in certain ways. And it behooves us to know our audience fully. Because obviously you wouldn't design the same thing for a scientific journal as you would for mass consumption on a newspaper website, for example. In simplistic terms, we take these questions that we need to answer, these business questions, and we assemble them essentially into a list. We put them in an order. Some of the questions are more important than others. And our visualizations answer those questions and tell a story. On the left-hand side of our screen here, we have, a very brief stab at a dashboard layout. There are a series of elements in the dashboard which lead to other visualizations, which lead to other visualizations, and so on and so forth until we drill down to the lowest level of detail. Pretty common hierarchical organization of a dashboard. You start with one audience, possibly a management team, and you drill down into very specific data on the details of how we answered those important questions. Ultimately, on the right, we see Bloom's taxonomy. Ultimately, we focus on the way in which our audience receives, interacts, and then synthesizes, hopefully, our data. Because ultimately, we want our data to be presented in a way, again, that changes minds, that persuades your audience to follow the path that you're laying out in your data story. And graphic design, again, reinforces that process. But before we get into the rest of the hardcore design information, one more quote for you. We all need people who will give us feedback. That's how we improve. One of the things we like to talk about at Tableau is a methodology that we have called Drive. Essentially, it's an outgrowth of rapid development processes that allow us to focus on how we work with our customers. So as a Tableau consultant, I work with customers. The customers may be developers who are developing visualizations and then presenting those visualizations to business users who consume that information and make business decisions. The presentation of that data is the end result of a process. The process that we initiate when we sit down with the client, that the client initiates when they sit down with their business users, and hopefully that process is iterative. It's a process that, certain technologies allow us to address quickly and rapidly to both fail and succeed as quickly as possible. And failure's not a bad thing, by the way. Okay, so finally we get to some design basics here. So as I mentioned, one of the most important things we'll talk about is the visual hierarchy. To a graphic designer, visual hierarchy means certain things. Firstly, it's an assemblage of position, size, weight, color, and white space, which may or may not seem intuitive to you if you haven't thought of that before, but the application of white space is also very important. And then essentially we have a number of elements that we put into our visualizations that may incorporate all of these elements: size, position, weight, color, white space, and possibly even motion, although that's not our focus for today. But if you did animations with your visualizations, then that obviously would include the motion aspect. So those of you who were probably born before 1990 may actually recognize what this is. It is a newspaper page. Ironically, I have given talks where not much of the audience really knew immediately what we were looking at. Most of them thought it was a web page, but it is indeed the layout of a newspaper page. So all of the things that we talk about from a design standpoint, how we position things on a page, they all are derived from this perception of the printing press. The simplest application of that is newspaper for most of us today, because very rarely do we do typeset books, but and most digital printing presses skip many of the processes that used to be a requirement for newspapers, but the layouts have remained the same almost in perpetuity. So we have titles, we have thumbnails, we have headlines, bylines, we have the concept of the fold, which is very important if you're dealing with a web page as well, because anything that requires you to scroll is below the fold. Gutters, subheads, tables of content, callouts, columns, and you may notice that I have a little mark out here. We don't actually call them information graphics these days. We tend to call them visualizations, or vizzes if you're a Tableau groupie like I am. So all of those positional elements are formatted for the Western mind, and they read top to bottom, left to right. Obviously, if you are in another part of the world and your language is not top to bottom, left to right, then you will have a different point of focus, perhaps top right to bottom left. So the second element we mentioned is weight. Weight is a conception of the amount of black in a page. So as you can see, we have a visualization with all of the color removed. If I had the color back in, you'd see bright oranges and yellows and blues, showing the number of freshmen enrolled in a particular university. As you can tell, there's lots of universities on the East Coast, and then a lot on the West Coast, and not a whole lot in between. But once we remove all that color, we discover that the application of black or weight in this page is a little less than clear. So if you think about the weight of the type that you use in your visualization, the weight of the picture, how dark the colors are, any of that application of black becomes weight and draws the eye. So if we follow on to that thought and we take a look at this particular visualization, which is a pretty interesting viz describing the history of music in the UK, in particular number of artists who were at #1 on the pop charts. What is the first thing, again, rhetorical question, what is the first thing that you see in this page? It's Jimi Hendrix on the left, because he possesses the most weight in the page. There's very little color in this page. You might see select a decade below to view details, right? The little bit that's in red, but we'll get the color in a moment. The next weightiest thing in this page is the black bar for the 50s, the slightly lighter bar from the 60s, and so on and so forth. right? Our eye is also drawn to the color legend on the top, which shows the spectrum from light gray to black for average weeks at number 1, right? So again, this is by removing most, if not all, of the color, this gives us a perception of how weight can influence what we see in a page. So you can very efficiently present a visualization without any color and use weight to lend emphasis to certain points of data. So, a few comments about color. First of all, I hate to say this, even after we spent a lot of time talking about black just now, black is not a color. And I'll go into that in a little more detail in a few moments. But suffice it to say, think of colors as the colors and not black. There are lots of great tools for choosing color sets and palettes, for aiding you in your selection of colors to find colors that work well together and inform a palette which you can reuse in your visualizations from most software packages. One of the ones that I like and have liked for years, even back when it was called Cooler, is color.adobe.com, which is a color picker that allows you to log in and save your color swatches and assemble them into palettes that you can then reuse in many platforms. It also has the benefit of giving you the hex colors, which are appropriate for web design, the RGB colors, etc., that you may need for your particular program of choice. Images are the kind of ultimate application of color because they use all of the colors at once. As such, they draw our eye very effectively. One of the things that I encourage is a little bit of caution when choosing colors. You don't have to fill your page with colors in order to be effective. You want to use your colors selectively to emphasize certain things in your data visualization. So if we go back to the beginning of how color works, we have two types of color, and you'll find this if you're browsing websites looking for particular color choices or palettes. And that is the difference between additive and subtractive color. Well, in most of our visualizations these days, we're not talking about print. We're talking about digital presentation. So we're actually talking about additive color. But which came first, the chicken or the egg? Ultimately, it doesn't really matter because the most important thing is how we think about the colors as they are presented to our users. Again, if you're printing, then you want to think of colors in one way. You want to think about your subtractive colors on the left of our color theory chart here. And if you're thinking about screen presentation or projection, you're thinking of additive colors, the RGB that we know so well. You'll notice that the overlap of those colors demonstrates pretty effectively how the colors are derived and how they work in the most common formats. On the left, we have CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. K is black. Don't ask. Unfortunately, I don't know. We have a number of color types, and this kind of gets back to what we may have learned back in kindergarten, right? Back in elementary school, we probably sat in an art class, and our teacher told us about primary colors. She or he may also have mentioned secondary colors, complementary colors, colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. Those are great for presenting contrast in some scenarios. As you notice, the two colors they selected for complementary may not exactly be ADA compliant. So those of you that work for the government may have trouble using that particular selection of complementary colors, but in general, the color wheel can be pretty useful. These days, we think of it more as a complete spectrum of colors because of all the digital tools we have at our disposal. Down in the bottom left, I don't know that I'm going to go with those particular descriptions, but the point is that colors have connotation. Cool colors evoke a certain mood, as do warm colors. So by warm, we mean the yellow, oranges, and reds. By cool, we mean the greens and blues. and the purples. So, by the way, this particular image comes from a website called Paperleaf, and they have a great, more detailed explanation of color theory. And there are lots of great resources for that. As I mentioned, color.adobe.com is great. So, earlier, I mentioned that black is not really a color choice. But it has a purpose, right? Well, essentially, the purpose, especially of a black background in our visualizations, is for when we're presenting in a darkened room. That's why the background of a movie screen is in a darkened room and is projected. So that use of additive color gives us white on a black background. In general, this is a gross generalization, we usually want to avoid black backgrounds, mostly because they negate any efforts we might take to use weight to convey meaning in our visualization. So in general, I recommend to clients not to use black backgrounds unless they have a very specific reason for doing so. Of course, that very specific reason may be because it's in the branding and marketing guide for their company. Hopefully, that's not the case for you, and you can pursue a white background whenever possible. So the representation of these colors is probably familiar to most of you who took a little high school science. We're looking at our good old friend here, Roy G. Biv. So the presentation of hot colors to cool colors. In science, this has to do with the wavelength and how we receive it on our eye. For most intents and purposes, we can consider this to be almost a hierarchical order of colors and the order in which they will attract the eye. Of course, this varies greatly depending on your background, depending on the ability of your user to see the green or the red, for example. But by and large, we could say that red is the hottest color. Or is it? So for those of you who may have studied a little cognitive science, you may have been presented with arguments that red is not necessarily the color that attracts the eye first. Many folks would say that it is actually yellow because it is the brightest. But, again, it usually depends on context. But I would say that either red or yellow attract the eye very quickly in your visualizations. Also, you want to use them sparingly. So if you have many things that are bright red, then they will all compete for the user's eye. Additionally, red has connotation, right? Red usually has a negative connotation, especially if you're dealing with financial data. Okay. So next, we'll be getting into this concept of type and font. So in general, we present typefaces as some sort of mystic art which we may or may not have full control over due to our marketing department guidelines. But many of us give very little thought to how we use certain typefaces within our visualizations. Basically, we pick the typeface that we like the most, and we usually run with that. But here's a little bit of background on type. Many of you have probably heard these terms, but may or may not know all the particulars of why they are called such things. So now we're looking at serif fonts. So serif means having feet. So you'll notice at the bottom of every letter, especially the A and the D, you will see little feet that come out. Actually, the serif font was developed primarily so that you could see differences in direction in letters when they were printed. So prior to the printing press, script was easier to identify because of the flourish of the hand. But when we dealt with printing presses, we kind of negated that. And the same constant size of letters in a printing press meant that we needed more distinction when we were dealing with very small type. And so in general, you'll find that most newspapers, for example, use serif fonts for their body type. so the smallest type that's available to them. They'll be using a serif font. There is an excellent example, by the way, some great examples of how to use typeface in web pages in particular at alistapart.com, but those same principles absolutely apply to visualizations. So I will recommend that. Then we have sans serif fonts, or without feet. So the sans serif font is most usually presented as a display typeface. So you'll find that in a header, for example. The particular font face you choose will give you certain connotations, right? So if you're dealing with a more modern topic, then perhaps a sans serif font would be more popular. Sans serif fonts became very popular in the 50s, and some think they have kind of a mid-century connotation, especially when you're dealing with typefaces like Helvetica or Futura, for example. But we don't need to spend a whole lot of time in there. Mostly I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the basics of typeface selection. Now, type can also be used as an element of art. The overlapping of font can become, this particular design is from a fairly famous designer, David Carson, who originally is probably most well known for his design of Rolling Stone's logo and magazine in the 60s and 70s, I believe. And he has, over the years, designed many, many things, and one of his trademarks is his use of type. So type can be art. In particular, it can be a way to convey data. So this is a very simple word cloud, for example. So the focused on the use of words within a particular website. So don't exclude the power of typeface by itself when presenting some of your data. Okay, so we've got some of those core elements. We've talked about hierarchy, we've talked about weight, we've talked about color and position, we've talked a little bit about typeface. So let's take a look at how we end up applying those in a design sense. In the design world, the ultimate application of these elements is usually the B word, branding. So you've probably heard branding bandied about by, again, the marketing department, who have told you that your visualizations may or may not be in the proper branding. They may or may not be using the proper typeface or the proper color for that logo. But ultimately, the message that we convey with these design elements is the consistency. And that consistency becomes our brand. So we're looking at the application of color, topography, weight, hierarchy, and in particular, the application of color and metaphor, right? So we're not going to get into how to design that brand mark for your company, but the idea is that consistent application of style and color will make your brand consistent for your client, be that internal or external. One of the most obvious applications of branding, and to some degree iconography, is the magazine. And here we're looking at some popular ones. But the reason I chose this particular slide and some of these particular magazines is because they're very well known. Many of you could walk into a newsstand, if you can find a newsstand near you, and you'll be able to immediately pick out Rolling Stone magazine, or Vogue, or Wired, or Esquire, because you know those logos if you're familiar with that brand. They don't even have to be in the foreground. They can be obscured. They can be obscured by banners, by photography. They still convey their meaning and are immediately recognizable. In this case, we're talking mostly about the selection of typeface, but also color and position. Rolling Stone will always be at the top. It will always be in red. It will always have the curly R. right? That is a very particular use, and because they have used it for so many years, it's become rote. It's something you recognize immediately. And not that you will be approaching that level of branding with your visualizations, but especially in the application of dashboards, consistent application of those concepts, in particular typeface, will go a long way to present a consistent and cohesive face for your clients and your consumers. So let's take a quick look at a logo that all of us recognize for many years. And let's consider how we feel when we change that logo. Many of you are aware that Google fairly recently changed its logo from the serif font that we see to a sans serif font, which is fairly different, but basically it's the same, right? It's just a typeface. We still got the same slanted E. Everything's really the same. But many of you probably remember the uproar this caused when they changed the logo. So just be aware that once you've established your brand, you don't really want to change it unless you have a very good reason for doing so. Okay, there's one other thing, and that's that we want to talk about from a design and visual perspective, and that's the application of themes and metaphors. In particular, we tell a story with our visualizations, with our graphical elements. And if we have the ability to emphasize certain things in our story or our data using a visual metaphor, then all the better. But wait, you may say, Dave, you just told us never to use black backgrounds. And here you are, you're showing us visualizations with black backgrounds. Well, it serves a purpose. Many of you probably recognize that this metaphor is of an equalizer. So it suits the purpose of the visualization in a certain context. I think it's okay. Is it something you want to do for an entire site or a collection of 50 dashboards? Probably not. But in the case of that one visualization, I think it works quite well. So what are the keys, just to kind of reiterate, what are the keys to an award-winning visualization or dashboard? Firstly, understand your audience. Think beyond the operational or lowest level data considerations. Establish your visual hierarchy. Use visual themes and metaphors. Repeat common actions in how you navigate your data, especially when it's interactive. And finally, look for visual depth. And that doesn't mean 3D charts. Think about how you present your data to your users and focus that knowledge into both denotation and connotation. So here are a few designs that I've kind of picked out. All of these happen to be from Tableau Public, which is a public website, as the name implies, that is hosted by Tableau, and many, many customers post their visualizations up there. You'll find that lots and lots of journalists in particular like to use that platform because it's very cheap for their publications. So they are using something that's going to be freely available to the public anyway, so why not post it to Tableau Public? This particular visualization is used for a analysis of public transportation in London, I believe. And it's one that was featured on Tableau Public a while back, and I think that it's a great application of many concepts, but there are a few things that we probably also want to point out. Initially, the thing we notice the most is the map and the graceful curve the map has been placed in, which is always interesting when you're dealing with visualizations. For those of you who have assembled dashboards in the past, it gets a little tricky. So this developer has very cleverly broken out of their grid layout to present that nice curve there. But there are lots of things that we want to think about when we look at this. What are the things that attract our eye? The thing that attracts my eye the most is both where I am, that little red dot. In addition, the times of day, the red areas. So my eye is drawn immediately to the red. Then it's drawn to the things that are weighted. So the daily trips, all trips, first ride. And then possibly the bar charts down at the bottom, which are kind of a secondary use of color. You'll notice that I'm not really talking about the things that are green, because green is used a lot in this visualization. So that detracts from its ability to draw the eye. Here's another visualization, very straightforward. And I like to use this visualization to illustrate, in particular, how we may think about our visual hierarchy. What is the most important element of the story we're trying to tell? Is it the age of presidents? If it's the age of presidents, then we've done a great job. Age is at the top. We focused on the oldest presidents at Inauguration Day and the youngest presidents at Inauguration Day, and we presented in a very large bullet the average age of those presidents. Is it where they're from? Is it what party they were affiliated with? Right? So we have a number of, due to their size and the colors used to portray them, we have a few things that compete in this visualization. They may not really mean the things that we think they mean. In general, I would say that probably the thing in the U.S. that most people are interested in is the party affiliation, but we've got that at the bottom. But, again, if the purpose is to convey the age of the presidents, then they did a pretty good job. Next, we have some election tracking from Canada, which is in an interesting format. And this is a particular use, which I believe was meant for mobile consumption. And one of the things that I like to mention to my clients is don't be afraid of unusual formats if they suit your purpose. In particular, if you have a platform for consumption that needs to be addressed specifically, don't be afraid of it. Embrace it. Leverage that ability to touch. Leverage that ability to convey as much as possible in a small space. This single metric KPI block that we have at the top does an excellent job of conveying the information it needs to convey, right? We also very effectively are tracking the position of those parties over time using our line graph. Very simple, very straightforward, and it answers the question at hand, right? So don't be afraid of those unusual formats. Also, following on with some of the things we talked about early on, know your audience. If your audience is expecting statistical analysis, don't shy away from statistical analysis. However, if your audience is maybe not expecting statistical analysis, perhaps you should shy away from some of those metaphors, right? Perhaps the projection lines, in this case, just serve to confuse some of our audience. But if the audience, and in this case, we're talking about probably a social science audience, is expecting certain things, then absolutely we should present them with those visual metaphors. And that's essentially what we're talking about. We're talking about some standard conventions that allow us to convey our data in a certain way. This happens to be a very simple example of statistical analysis. In whatever platform you use on a regular basis, you may have may have potentially much more complex statistical analyses that you could apply in a visual way. Again, know your audience. If the consumption is meant for that scientific user, then by all means, you should absolutely provide the detail that they expect. But be careful if they're not. So one of the things that I've mentioned throughout is this ability of us to tell a story when we deal with our visualizations. So when we're working in Tableau in particular, this is very easy. We have a presentation method called a story, and it allows us to step by step walk through certain visualizations or dashboards to to convey our points of our story and hopefully make the best and most persuasive case to our audience. If your particular platform of choice doesn't include that capability, think about the order in which your users navigate to your visualizations. Do they slowly reveal your point? Do they immediately convey your point? How do you step through those? Does something make it more convincing than another? Again, be aware of your audience and how they will attribute connotation to your visualizations. And this is a great exercise that I encourage many of you to try if you have the opportunity. And that is to periodically take some of your visualizations and try stripping away all of the text, all of the copy. What are you left with? Is it something that means something to your audience? Can you convey the message, the story that you need to convey without the text? If you need lots of text, perhaps your visualizations are not as succinct as they might be. And so, again, one of the themes that we've kind of been emphasizing in a bit of an oblique way is simplicity. What does this particular visualization mean? What am I trying to convey? What do the colors at the top mean? Without the text, and this is intentionally in a foreign language, without the text, I don't really know what the map is conveying. I think Australia is doing a lot of something, but other than that, I'm not really sure what it means. What about the things down at the bottom? Those iconographics are interesting. They seem to be portraying elements of vice, but I don't really know what they mean. But I get the suspicion that it has to do with, bad things that people may do in certain countries. I guess that means that Australians really like to drink, smoke, and gamble. Hopefully, if you're Australian and on this call, I don't get any hate letters. I apologize. I did not do this visualization. If we take a look at some other portrayals of information, they may be a little more abstract than we intend for our audience. Take a look at this analysis of Facebook users. What does it mean? Is it easy for us to quickly discern what it means? If we think about it long enough, we can tell that it's probably a display of countries as blocks, with the U.S. being the big green block and South America being the red blocks, with Brazil probably being the largest one, right? So we get some idea of what it means, but it does take a few seconds to try and discern what that means. Again, if I remove the text there, what would it mean to me? And as I close out, I want to show you one or two visualizations that are a little more food for thought, and I want to pose a few more of these rhetorical questions. So this visualization is one that many of you probably recognize, and if you've been thinking about data science for a while, somewhere along the lines, you've probably seen this. This is a visual description of Napoleon's march into Russia, right? Here are a few rhetorical questions. What does the visualization mean to you? Does it have connotation? What's the connotation? What is its purpose? Do you think there's additional context to this visualization? What was that context? Political? Ethical? Something else? What do you think it meant to the first person who looked at it in 1869? And then ultimately, do you think they understood it? And now we have another visualization by that famous designer, Joseph Menard. What do you think about this design? Do you think this design is something that we talk about in textbooks on a daily basis? Do you think this is something that will be holding up as a scion of information design in the future? But which of the two do you think was more readily understood. So, enough of the rhetorical questions. We're going to beat our dead horse here for a moment. Just a few of those design tips reiterated. First of all, make sure you establish a visual hierarchy. Use typography as a graphical element. Focus on color and its selection and your use of photos to provide focus. Think about how you use visual themes predictably and repeatedly. How do they convey connotation? Are you following standards for usability and accessibility? Don't underestimate the use of not having these elements in a page to provide emphasis. And ultimately, keep it simple. All right. So I think that's it for me. If we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Well, Dave, thanks so much for that excellent presentation. We'll get started on today's Q&A session. And I want to thank the audience for their participation. We've had a great many questions that have come in during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through them all in the time remaining. So during this Q&A session, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for Dave if you'd like to contact him following today's webinar. So let's get started with the audience questions. Dave, this is great, but tell us a little bit about how you incorporate these principles into the work with your clients.
Sure, thanks. So when I'm on site with a client, we have many, many goals during the visit. But essentially, our clients all want the same thing. They all want to persuade a particular audience to make a change. And normally that change is focused on the data that we present. And so I quite frequently spend time working with customers in their existing visualizations, talking about the things that they think work well and the things they don't. And then I kind of frame them in some of the things we've talked about already. You know, do they fit with their information architecture? What is the hierarchy of those visualizations on the page? Do they really answer the business questions? And frequently, when we go through the process of defining those kind of business-driven questions, the things that they need to answer in their visualizations, we find that many times we're not getting to that extra level. We're not finding the added value. And so the visualization aspects, you know, the application of some of these simple graphic design principles allow us to more effectively emphasize the elements of the story we want to tell.
Okay. Well, thank you. And, you know, a little bit further to that, you place a lot of emphasis on client feedback. How do you go about soliciting the feedback from your clients as part of your work?
Sure. I touched on this a little bit in an earlier slide, but essentially we spend a good amount of time working, ideally, with the business users. So I may come into a client and I'll be working with the IT office, for example, when I'm setting up Tableau server. But when I get down into the visualizations, I'm frequently working directly with the business users. They have certain expectations, and we go through an iterative process of drilling down to the core business questions they need to answer, and then iterating on the fly with that user through their data to get to, you know, that core business question that they need to answer that's going to provide them with additional value. So the key to that is the iteration. And so frequently I'll spend, you know, half a day with the business unit, sit down, go through questions, make sure that the visualizations we're working with are really answering those questions and making sure that they provide the most persuasive story.
Yeah, I get it. Iteration is always the way to go. You know, your whole presentation has been focused on this concept of practical design. Can you tell us a little bit more about practical design as opposed to some of the research-oriented approaches to design?
Sure. You know, many times I'll be presenting to an audience, and there will be a large number of behavioral scientists or cognitive scientists or, you know, very advanced statisticians in the audience. And suffice it to say that there may be a different kind of point of view on many of these things. Those of you who may have read some work of Few or Tufte, who are some luminaries in the field of data visualization, know that they have very strong feelings about that, or probably would have very strong feelings about that last visualization that I showed, the one with the pie charts on the map of France, right? My personal experience has led me to more of a practical presentation, focusing on a lot of the simple questions that we encounter as designers of data visualization. So the idea is to find those simple things that allow us to present our data effectively, and if we want to go down the road into more of the science, certainly by all means I encourage you guys to do that. But my focus is usually on the more practical elements, the way they're applied, how they're consumed, and what's going to get you the most bang for your buck in a short period of time.
Okay. So toward the end of your presentation, you showed us a number of visualizations that seem to incorporate elements of art in the presentation. Were you suggesting that was a good idea, or were those just examples of some things that were good and some things that were bad?
Largely they're for example purposes, but yeah, definitely art can be, we could consider that in many different ways, right? So, for example, you could consider the word cloud to be art. So when we take those particular words and present them as a focus of our data, so in this particular slide, when we're looking at that, this conveys multiple things, right? So upon rollover, I may see how many times that particular word was repeated. Well, as a whole, it becomes artwork, right? If we take a look at, honestly, many of the slides that I use today, the background is a scatter plot, right? So that in and of itself could be considered art. So and many times we consider art to just be, that photo that we're including there for visual interest, or perhaps an animation of some sort. But ultimately, much of our data could become artwork. And the question is it useful artwork? And that gets back to that practical question.
Yes, that practical issue, and that's a good focus. So perhaps a last question, relative to Tableau, a lot of us don't have access to design consultants. Does Tableau have a process embedded that helps us avoid some of these major mistakes? You talked about, for example, a feature of Tableau that was something about telling a story. Is there enough guidance within that tool to keep us out of trouble?
Well, I don't know that any tool could completely keep us out of trouble. Tableau is actually quite good at presenting to you very common design visualization methodology that works well for the data that you presented. In many cases, that's quite simplistic presentation. So if you want really complex presentation, then you kind of have to go down another route. And not that that's not to be expected, but Tableau does a great job of guiding you through those kind of simplistic visualizations. The story tool itself gives you a lot of leeway. As you might imagine, it looks a little bit like PowerPoint, and that's basically how it works. So it will allow you to present basically whatever you want. So if your visualizations are very complex, so if I have a dashboard with 8 elements and I try to cram that into my little storyboard, it may lose a little bit of meaning because of size and space, real estate available for the visualization. So it does a little bit of that, guiding you towards that actualization of your visualization. But as with most tools, you could probably abuse it fairly easily.
Well, Dave, thank you for some great answers to some very good questions. You know, for those of you who asked questions that weren't answered today, and unfortunately we had to leave a lot on the table, we'll be sending all those unanswered questions to Dave and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. I have just a few quick announcements. Please mark your calendar for February 9th and our next Data Science Central webinar. Details of that webinar will be forthcoming in the next few days. Also, please remember that today's taping will be available on demand for viewing later today, and you can find that on the home page of Data Science Central in the Webinar tab located at the top of the page. Well, this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions. And a special thanks again to Tableau for their sponsorship and our speaker today, Dave Powell, for his insight into today's topic. My name is Bill Vorhies. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on February 9th. Have a great day.